This is lecture 9 in the Western intellectual tradition. I'll call this the Enlightenment and Memoricide, three traditions. When most of us hear the word the Enlightenment within Western intellectual thought or Western political tradition, already you can get the sense of history moving forward. We are the enlightened ones. And usually the Enlightenment period of time emerges in the late 16th century, and by the Victorian era or the 19th century, that period of ferment within Western intellectual, political, literary, philosophical, theological thought has run its course and moved into its next phase of worldview in that sense, and how people interpret what is the good life, the meaningful life, soul and society. But already you can get this sense when you hear the word enlightenment from the 17th, 19th century, is that the notion that history as progress, history moving forward. And so we are the enlightened ones, and often the image is used the Enlightenment and the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. And so there's this whole notion that has crept in terms of the enlightened being more progressive, the Western liberal notion of progress. And so by the time you get to this period of history, the Enlightenment itself is seen as a period of a greater awakening, a greater understanding of what's important, greater role of science versus religion. But what I want to do, and as a result of that, the past is not as important. It's at a lesser level of understanding. We are evolving beyond those who have gone before us. And hence, if you study the past, it's only as archaeological work, it's our archival work. It just doesn't have the depth, the insights, the moral vigor, the wisdom that we have as we progressively move forward. And of course, this is a form of what C.S. Lewis would call chronological snobbery. As a result of this, very paternalistic, as if we are the ones who know. Those who have begun before us do not know in quite the same way. The Enlightenment, and hence memoricide. So most people today, if they are asked to tell me something about the wisdom, the insight of the past, they're probably pretty good, and well, probably they don't know a lot about it other than fairly bland and limited understanding with a few little dates and facts. But in terms of the big world views and understanding of what the good life is, what is justice, what is peace, what is an ecological vision of the good life, most have not read these great classics of literature, the women and men of the past. And that's part of, they are just themselves products of their own cultural ethos, their own education, their own family upbringing, in which there is only a smattering or something very thin about the past. And so the past really plays no role in informing the present, because it really does not contribute, because it is a lesser level of knowing. So hence memoricide, there's no memory. And of course, if people have no memory, memory is a form of both personal and culture orienting. And without memory, it's very difficult to know what is the good life, even how to compare and contrast if you have nothing to compare and contrast with. Now, there are three small t traditions within the large T Enlightenment liberal tradition, or what's called modernity, or the modern world itself. One is, and often people tend to think the Enlightenment is just one homogenous tradition, which of course it isn't. That would be silly to think that way. No period of time is homogenous. You have women and men contesting, debating, dialogue, trying to understand what makes for the good life. The right wing of the Enlightenment, and many people think the Enlightenment, they think of primarily the right wing of the Enlightenment. It came to be dominated by a certain view of science, not all forms of science, but a certain view of science, in which the scientific way of knowing, the empirical way of knowing, was primarily the dominant way of knowing, by which objective information could be produced either in an empirical way or through logic or induction or deduction. And science delivered objective goods that was for the good of society. And the rise of science, a certain form of science, and secularism became the means of defining significant elements of the Enlightenment tradition itself. And so within this Enlightenment heritage is that religion um, could not demonstrate invisible or qualitative truths in the same way science could prove quantitative truths in an empirical or well argued way. So, increasingly so, what happens is the right wing of the Enlightenment moves towards increasingly so a very secular or aggressive form or hard secularism in which science becomes the scientists become the new high priests. They're the final court of authority. And if people can't prove themselves before this court, they're dismissed, as it were, from the intellectual castle of the modern world. Now, that rational way of knowing certainly came under strong criticism within the Enlightenment heritage itself. That's called the rationalist scientific wing of the Enlightenment. And it tended to be very imperialistic. It colonized other forms of knowing. So even though it saw itself in many ways as being the enlightened movement forward, it did colonize or deprecate or demean other ways of knowing. Now, literally within this period of time, there was a strong reaction to that way of knowing and defining enlightenment in a very different way. This was the romantic reaction to the rationalist way of knowing, the way of the imagination, the way of myth, the way of storytelling, the way of intuition, the way of imagination. And the romantic rebellion against the imperial nature of the rationalist scientific way of knowing was also a way of being enlightened in that sense. And so within the romantic tradition, within the Enlightenment itself, they argued that the scientific rationalist way, yes, it revealed some goods, but the deeper goods of life it concealed, and it was through intuition and imagination and myth and story that, in fact, the deeper elements of reality were revealed. And so there was this tension then that emerged within the Enlightenment. Who defines the Enlightenment and whose version of the Enlightenment? The rationalist, scientific, the romantic, the literary, the people of the heart rather than the people of the head, and need it be either or in terms of understanding this. We've looked at people earlier like Hegel and Kant in obviously the German Enlightenment, and Goethe, another key figure within the German Enlightenment. They never slipped into either or, because the danger always is that in the pendulum theory of culture and intellectual thought, if something swings too far one way, then often the reaction goes the other way and negates what has gone before. Now, those like Hegel and Kant tried to bring together the best of the romantic and the rationalist tradition in how they understood what it meant to think, how do you do philosophy, the relationship of the secular to the sacred, or religion and spirituality to science. These great thinkers, the centrist wing of the Enlightenment, attempted to argue, or what we call the humanist wing of the Enlightenment. They tried to bring together, in fact, the best of what reason and science revealed, the best of what the romantic tradition revealed, recognizing both had their distortions, their Achilles heel. And so this humanist wing, or the third small t tradition of the Enlightenment itself, is very important to understand what's called the dialectic of the Enlightenment and the internal tensions and the clashes within the Enlightenment project between the rationalist wing, the romantic wing, the humanist wing, which attempts to bring them together. You can see this played out, for example, in the English tradition itself, between the high Tories of Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey. They saw much good in science, but they also saw science, particularly when it became an agent of technology and business and corporations, or the military or the state, as in fact science or Galileo's children serving power. And so science really, a great deal of its work beyond pure science, often served greater interests in science itself. And certainly the high romantics, living in the Lake Districts as they did, saw the pollution the treatment of people and the land in northern England. And so their relationship of the Romantic tradition with ecology was very, very important through also poetry and the use of the state to limit the power of corporations and businesses in the workshop of the world. And so the English Romantics were certainly not anti-religious. They saw good in secularism, but they saw great depths in the sacred itself. Also, within elements of the high Romantic tradition, they were very indebted to the wisdom of the past, or an organic relationship between the past, the present, and the future. And so, unlike the right wing and certain elements of the Enlightenment dialectically that ever moved forward Hegelian style, the Romantic humanist wing of the Enlightenment, when it put a leash on the scientific and rationalist wing of the Enlightenment, argued, in fact, perhaps our phase in history we see important things, but in fact, in our haste, in our flattering ourselves on where we're going, in fact, we are losing the wisdom of the past, the great insights of the past. And so the high Tory, or the left wing of the Romantic Enlightenment, was very indebted, in fact, to the wisdom in the organic nature of the past, and recognizing to dismiss that dialectically in the name of progress and optimism was then very much to be a cyclops or reductionistic or one-dimensional. And so it was the Romantic, particularly the high Romantics, not necessarily the low Romantics, but the high Romantics, with their view of the wisdom, the mother lode of the past, and the relationship of that in the present for the future, which had a way of leashing elements of the scientific rationalist way of knowing and where that would go. So the Enlightenment itself, one thing that always has to ask, whose version of the Enlightenment? And often it's only taught in a simplistic one-dimensional manner, which distorts a very complex period of time within England and France and Germany and Scandinavia, North America, Latin America, other parts of the world, in fact. And one way of interpreting it is history is moving forward in an evolutionary, progressive, optimistic way, and science and reason is going to bring in the new utopia, the new Jerusalem. The Romantic and the humanist element of the Enlightenment argued when you go down that path, in fact, you're going to create dystopias. In fact, there's going to be great suffering for the earth, the physical world itself, ecology, and for people. And so the centrist and left wing of the Enlightenment, or we could also see high Toryism as a part of that, came as a corrective and a counterculture to the right wing of the Enlightenment. And this leads to, in one sense, then how is Western history to be meaningfully understood other than in a simplistic, very simplistic way as progress, as Hegelian positive way ever forward. And of course, many of the late modern Romantics were very critical of both Hegel and Marx. People will be getting to as we move on. Of course, Nietzsche and Heidegger, they just found that right wing of the Enlightenment simplistic, as they did many other key elements. This was the battle within the Romantic tradition itself against who defines Romanticism. And of course, there's various definitions and thinkers who go in different directions with that. So the Enlightenment as a key element of Western intellectual history, the big T Enlightenment, it's a product, it doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's a product of the unfolding of the Renaissance of the late 15th, 16th century, the Reformation, and as they move ever forward, the whole Renaissance, Reformation tensions then spilled over into the complex nature of the Enlightenment itself. And we are all heirs, for good or ill, of the 16th century as it was reinterpreted through the Enlightenment process, and we live with much of that today. We must always be careful, though, when thinking through these things. In particular, you get people strutting out their own positions, for example, like the new atheists on the public stage, as if that's what real science is about, or that's what the Enlightenment's all about. You want to say, no, don't be so silly and simplistic. First of all, science is more complex than what's being articulated there. The dismissal of the sacred, well, most within the Enlightenment were not, they didn't dismiss the sacred. They saw the sacred and the secular as like two legs or 2 feet of what it means to be human in a minimally significant way. And so a lot of the issues, once we parse them today and we see people strutting on the stage their ideological positions, they're really just fragments in many ways of a debate that was already very much intense in the Enlightenment period and also in the Reformation and the Renaissance period in history. This is why intellectual history is so important, because then you can put, in terms of the large mountain of intellectual thought, you can see what trail someone's coming up, what little intellectual acreage they call home, what they're missing in terms of the big picture. And so intellectual thought gives you a sense of the big mountain of cultural, intellectual, political, religious, literary thought, from which then when someone struts their conclusions or pontificates about something, you can say, oh, I see, this is where they are on the mountain. This is the little trail they're on, and this is the little acreage, and they're claiming that their little home and acreage is the mountain itself of cultural and intellectual thought. And so the Enlightenment tradition, it itself is an acreage on the much bigger mountain of Western cultural intellectual thought. And to know what it contributes to where we are today, who, as it were, the messiahs and the sages of that, where they stand within the Enlightenment tradition itself, and how the Enlightenment tradition is part of something much bigger. So the rationalist, the romantic, the humanist, and when we get to who we will be getting to in a couple of weeks, Charles Taylor, preeminent Canadian philosopher, he would be one of the great apologists of the Enlightenment project. And so in studying him and then comparing him to George Grant, probably one of the most significant thinkers of high Toryism, we can get a sense of how people differently interpret the history of culture and civilization, not just cognitively, but what are the implications and consequences, practically speaking, for thinking thoughts that either do hurt or harm or good, or nourish the soul and society in a meaningful way. For as Weaver once said, ideas do have consequences. And if our ideas are somewhat skewed or reductionistic or simplistic, there are consequences for that, both for people, friendships, families, societies, international politics.